You know, when you're a child, you hear these stories over and over and you think, oh no, there goes Uncle such and such telling that story again. And I never really appreciated it until I got older. And I realized how these stories had really shaped me. You know, The Kitchen of Small Hours. When Aunt Hatsu took a pair of kitchen shears to the family album and cut her daughter out from each picture, soluble life suspended in silver tones, the woman knew what she was doing. Call it love's revenge, subtracting time from tenderness, a proof there was no story, just a disturbance, swaddled in silence, a stillborn's kept urn. There was a west-facing wall the late sun climbed in afternoons, a day calendar's torn page discarded with a fading light. The paint was the color of nursed remorses, yellowing then flaking from the bare wall. Time's gentle nudges turned the clock hands to the kitchen of small hours, with its clean linoleum floor, white icebox, and behind the cabinet door, a cricket kindling, where, mixing her days and nights, nights and days, Hatsu cooked batches of sugar water on the stove, boiling, stirring the thickening syrup of memories in great vats over a blue gas flame. When her daughter returned, Hatsu looked into that dutiful face, like a child querying its reflection in a puddle, the soft lineaments touched by the glamour of recognition, familiar and strange, a trick of light. The story that begins about the auntie cutting out the picture of her daughter from all the pictures in the album is a true story. It was a family story that was told to me. Um, and later on, the woman who's called Anhatsu, but that's not her real name, she developed Alzheimer's, and she started cooking sugar water at in the wee hours of the night, in the small hours of the night. And so her daughter, who she actually ejected from her life, had to come back to take care of her mother, you know. So there is this reconciliation, but the forgiveness comes by means of illness, um, not necessarily because there was an understanding. And I just felt that there were so many, how do you say it, family complications in that story, that in the end, family is family. And whether or not we see to eye or even forgive one another or come to an understanding, sometimes the call of being dutiful as a daughter or son can override that,
Mhm.
you know, and bring family together. And so to me, it was a very complicated and difficult story. It doesn't necessarily have a happy ending, but I think it showed to me the bonds that can exist in family, even when there are differences that seem irreconcilable,
Mhm.
if that makes sense. And so that's one of the reasons why I think I chose it. Um, so the title is Lahaina Obabang teaches her great granddaughters about business and life. Women don't drive, was what my husband said. So I told him, teach me to drive or I'm leaving you. He relented once he saw I meant exactly what I'd said. That's how Obabang became the first woman cab driver on Maui. You see, I knew the hired cabbies were cheating us, but I had to prove it to my husband. I was a quick learner, got my license, and started taxiing. With the money I brought in just that first day, it wasn't hard to convince my husband that the drivers were pocketing the fares. I got each to confess, then fired them all. Men are that way. Don't reason, demonstrate. What was interesting about this poem was I tried to write it as a third person narrative and it didn't work.
Mm.
And one day I realized I had to tell it in the voice of my great grandmother. And at first I resisted because I'd never written a poem in a woman's voice before. And I didn't know how I was going to sort of cross that threshold and explore that territory. Um, but the minute I began with my great grandmother's voice. I knew that I had to tell the poem in her voice
Mhm.
and from her point of view. And as a great grandmother, sort of passing on life lessons to her granddaughters, you know. And it took me a long, actually, once I started writing the poem in her voice, it almost wrote itself, except for the last line. I must have struggled for a couple of years before the last line came out. Um, and I realized that I'd gotten it right um, when I got the last line. It was just one of those moments that I said, that's it, that's it. And then I sent it out, and it was accepted for publication. Even though these weren't her literal words, she would approve of something like that because that's basically how she lived her life. Because women in that era, particularly in the Japanese American, well, actually, she was Okinawan American community, they didn't have a voice. And my great grandmother understood this. And so the way that she, I guess, made her way in the world was to learn things and demonstrate that through her skill and her ambition and her courage that she could actually swing things in her favor. And so, what I really love about this story too was that after she got her license, she taught other women how to drive as
Mm.
well. So she was kind of a pioneer
Mhm.
in that sense, in that part of Hawaii at that particular time. So. Sometimes if you overload the poem with too much lyricism, there's no single line that will pack a punch. And sometimes, in the first poem, for example, I want that last line to kind of pack a punch. And in some ways, keeping it like regular prose or like conversation
Mhm.
helps the line that you want to pack a punch stand out a little bit more. So I actually have an image for this in my mind. It's like if you've ever like gone to a lake and the lake is very calm and you see one of these fish jump up and make a splash.
Yeah.
So the reason why that fish jumping up is so stunning is because the lake is so flat and so still. And so in a way, I kind of like to write that way. So have a lot of it be fairly prosaic and straightforward. So when you want that single image to have an impact, it kind of makes a splash, so to
Yeah.
speak. So that's kind of the aesthetic that I write from.
That's
How shall I say it? The difficult family poems that I almost wanted to keep out of the collection um, because I didn't know how to deal with those kinds of skeletons in the closet. But eventually I realized that I had to tell those stories. And the purpose was to come to a point of understanding and acceptance, even if these were sort of not the kinds of things that you would want to necessarily share with others.
Mhm.
You wouldn't want to post something like this on Facebook, but it is who we are. And the thing that converted it to a poem is I like to be very compact in my writing and try to say as much as possible or cover as much ground in as few words as possible.
Mhm.
And I realized that as much as I want to write a short story or novel, in the end, I'm a poet and I have to tell this
Yes.
as a poet. And when you're a poet, what you do is you have to condense things, you just have to find the movement and the arc of the story, not necessarily flesh out the details, but make these leaps of imagination, intuition that help to weave the strands of the story together.
Mhm.
That the first poem, the reason why I put it first is I think that was the moment when I had that breakthrough, when I was able to cross that threshold and actually inhabit the life of another person through their story as much as I'm capable of doing through my imagination. So, and a lot of that means erasing my own ego, like how I feel about the story it means kind of crossing into uncomfortable territory, but to the point where you get past the discomfort and it's just there, you
Mhm.
know? Inevitably, it is maybe a piece of conversation, a fragment of a story that I hear that just kind of lodges in my mind. And I know that there's something there, but I don't know exactly how it's going to become a poem. And so I don't actually keep very many notebooks. I do a lot of, I guess I let things gestate a long time,
Mhm.
But I just have a feeling, and it could be just like a word that somebody says or a piece of a story. Um, and I just recognize that there's something there that needs to be told. And it's just a matter of being patient and allowing it to kind of emerge. So usually what will happen when I'm writing is I'll begin with that kernel of a story or like a fragment from a conversation, and I'll start to write around that. And most of it ends up being discarded, but eventually I'll hit on it's either something that I recognize as a voice or a kind of music to the language. And again, it can be very prosaic in its music because I think ordinary conversation has its own kind of music too, which I really, really love.
Yeah.
Um, but I recognize it as a kind of music, and I let the music that the poem generates move the poem forward.
Mhm.
I find that if I try to think like, okay, here's where the story needs to go next, inevitably it goes wrong. But if I listen to the music that's being generated by these lines as they kind of are laid down in the poem, I find that that actually helps the poem to move forward. So it's very blind in the sense that I never know where the poem is going, but I kind of know from the music that's being generated from the previous lines where to go next.
Right.
A lot of the poems that I wrote for this book, I had a very different writing process than I have now. So a lot of these poems, there was a lot of time that would pass between writing because I would only kind of write when the mood struck. And
Mhm.
I could tell when a poem was coming. And, I would sit myself down and make sure that I wrote it down. But I didn't have a regular schedule. But I think that's why it took so long for this book to come out, because a lot of the poems that I wrote, actually I wrote while I was an undergraduate in college, and it's been many, many years since then. Um, Now, though, I do find that having a regular habit of setting time aside and just setting my timer for 30 minutes and saying, I'm just going to dedicate the next 30 minutes to writing, and I just see what comes out. That's actually been much more productive for
Mhm.
me. But then I think it would have been a different book if I had written that way.